Imagine waking up one morning and hearing that the most powerful army in Europe, God's own warriors, had vanished overnight. Whispers fill the streets. The church stays silent, and the smoke still rises from the pyres. The Knights Templar, officially known as the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, had disappeared. Arrested, tortured, burned alive, accused of worshiping the devil himself. But what really happened? Were the Templars truly heretics, or victims of the greatest political conspiracy of the Middle Ages? The beginning, a holy army is born. It all began in blood. The year was 1119. The roads to Jerusalem were soaked with the blood of pilgrims, slaughtered by bandits and Saracen raiders. And in the middle of that chaos, a knight named Hugues de Payens had a wild idea: to protect the pilgrims, not for gold, not for glory, but for God. He and 8 other knights took a sacred vow and called themselves the Poor Knights of the Temple of Solomon. 9 men, no fortune, no army, only faith and steel. They were given quarters near the ruins of the ancient Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And from those ruins, a legend began. They weren't just warriors anymore. They were monks with swords, the seal of heaven. The church saw in them divine purpose. And in 1129, the Pope officially recognized the Templars at the Council of Troyes. From that moment on, they were no longer outsiders. They were the soldiers of heaven. White mantles, a single red cross, a symbol that would soon strike fear across continents. Gold poured in. Lands, castles, recruits. Even the sons of kings joined their ranks. But the Templars were not just fighters. They became builders, bankers, and keepers of trust. A nobleman could deposit gold in Paris and withdraw it in Jerusalem, sealed with the mark of the temple. The world's first international banking system, run by warrior monks. But power, as always, comes at a price. The shadow behind the cross. By the late 12th century, the Templars were richer than kings. They owned fortresses from Scotland to Jerusalem, fleets that sailed without royal command, and vaults of treasure buried deep beneath their temples. They answered to no crown, only to the Pope. To some, they were heroes. To others, a dangerous power. Rumors began to spread that they guarded forbidden relics, that they possessed ancient books of knowledge, or even the Holy Grail itself. No one really knew. Inside Templar walls, silence was law. Their initiation rites were secret. Their oaths, sealed with fear, betrayal, meant death in this life and the next. But those very secrets would one day become the chains that destroyed them. The beginning of the end. The year is 1307. The Holy Land is lost. Jerusalem gone. The Crusades failed. The Knights Templar, once hailed as saviors, had become a burden, an independent, wealthy order no king could control. Enter King Philip IV of France, Philip the Fair. He was neither fair in looks nor in heart. France was bankrupt, and Philip owed the Templars a fortune. But debts are easily erased if your creditors no longer exist. So, in the dark halls of his palace, Philip plotted the unthinkable, the destruction of God's own army. Friday the 13th. Before dawn, October 13th, 1307, the day the world would remember as cursed. Across France, royal soldiers moved under the cover of night. Doors were smashed open, scrolls seized, Templars dragged from their beds in chains. The charges? Blasphemy, idolatry, sodomy, and worst of all, worshipping a demon called Baphomet. The world was stunned. How could it be? Had the holiest order in Christendom truly turned into a cult of the devil? Or was something far darker at play? They called it justice. But what happened behind those stone walls was anything but holy. The year is 1307, and the once glorious Knights Templar, the pride of Christendom, now rot in the dungeons of France. Their white mantles are gone, their red crosses torn away. All that remains are chains. And the man behind it all, King Philip the Fair, is just getting started. The Inquisition begins. Philip needed more than arrests. He needed confessions, because without them, his crusade against the Templars would crumble before the Pope. So, he unleashed the Inquisition, a machine of fear, a system built to break men not to find truth. The Templars were dragged from their cells, one by one, some beaten, some starved, others burned until they spoke. And speak they did. Under the weight of iron and flame, many confessed to impossible sins. Spitting on the cross, denying Christ, kissing demons. But there was one problem. Every confession told a different story. Still, to Philip, the details didn't matter. He had what he wanted, words on parchment, sealed in blood and pain. The Pope's dilemma. In Rome, Pope Clement V was trapped. He knew something was wrong, that the confessions had been ripped from the Templars by torture. But Philip was too powerful, too dangerous. France's armies surrounded him, and Philip's message was clear. Either you condemn them, or you face me. So in 1309, the Pope convened the Council of Vienne, the official trial of the Knights Templar. But by then, the verdict was already written. Clement dissolved the order in the interest of peace within the church. The words were holy. The act, anything but. The last Grand Master. For 7 long years, the Templars waited for justice that never came. Their lands were stolen, their brothers vanished, and their name cursed. Then, in 1314, the final chapter was written. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars, was led to a scaffold on the Ile de la Cité in Paris. An old man now, chained, broken, but unbowed. They offered him mercy if he confessed once more. He refused. As the flames rose around him, de Molay lifted his head and shouted words that echoed through history. God knows who is wrong and who has sinned. And soon, misfortune will fall upon those who condemned us unjustly. Within a year, both Pope Clement and King Philip were dead. The Templars were gone, but their curse had begun. Some say the Templars took their secrets with them. Others believe their treasure still lies buried beneath the ruins of their temples, guarded by the silence of centuries. But maybe their greatest treasure wasn't gold at all. Maybe it was the truth. A truth the world was never meant to know. The fires of the Crusades had died, but from their ashes, a darker fire was lit, one that burned not in the sands of Jerusalem, but in the courts of Europe. The holy warriors who once defended Christendom now stood accused of betraying it, and their judges were not Saracens, but the church itself. The year was 1307. France trembled under the weight of rumor and fear. In the cathedrals of Paris, whispers slithered through the stone halls. Whispers of heresy, of midnight rituals, of blasphemies, whispered in secret vaults. And the name that haunted every mouth was Templar. The Inquisition begins. They called it an inquiry, but in truth, it was an execution dressed in parchment and ink. King Philip IV, Philip the Fair, had already decided the verdict. His coffers were empty, his debts to the Templars enormous, and his ambition infinite. The Knights' destruction was not a question of guilt. It was a matter of necessity. So, the king sent his men to the dungeons of Paris, where iron met flesh, and truth was forged through agony. In those cold chambers, confessions became currency. Ropes tightened, flames kissed skin, and men who had faced death in battle wept before the instruments of pain. "We served Christ with the sword," whispered one Templar as his hands were crushed, "and now we meet him with fire." The inquisitors nodded, writing his words as proof. Not of faith, but of guilt. The confessions. Over the weeks, the stories spread like plague. Some said the Templars spat upon the cross, that they worshipped a severed head named Baphomet, that they denied Christ in secret ceremonies lit by black candles. But the truth, if truth still lived, was buried under screams. Men confessed to anything that would make the pain stop. Some cried out to God for mercy. Others went silent, their tongues torn, their spirits shattered. And still, the church recorded every word. Each tortured breath became evidence. Each broken man a sinner redeemed by confession. In the archives of Notre Dame, sealed scrolls still bear those trembling signatures. One in particular stands out, that of Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Order. He confessed, yes, but his confession, like his torment, was extracted through iron and flame. "They made me speak lies," he would later say. But a lie carved from pain cannot wound the truth. The silence of Rome, while the dungeons of Paris filled with ashes, the Vatican remained silent. Pope Clement V, the supposed shepherd of Christ's warriors, hesitated. He owed his crown to Philip's favor, and Philip demanded obedience. The Pope announced a formal investigation, a gesture meant to appear holy but empty of mercy. Templar preceptors across Europe were summoned, interrogated, and imprisoned. Some fled to Portugal and Scotland. Others were hunted like animals, dragged before bishops, and forced to kneel before men who once called them brothers in Christ. The church turned its face away, and where the light of faith should have shone, there was only shadow. The temple's fall. Templar castles once stood like mountains of stone, symbols of faith and defiance. Now, they were stripped bare. The banners with the red cross were torn down. The vaults opened, the gold divided between kings and cardinals. In France alone, hundreds of knights were condemned. Some burned, others vanished in the silence of midnight executions. Those who lived long enough to speak before their deaths spoke not of guilt, but of betrayal. "We took vows of poverty," one said, before the flames rose, "and yet the world envied our gold. We took vows of chastity and were accused of sin. We took vows of obedience and were betrayed by the throne of Christ himself." The crowd watched in silence as the fire devoured his words. For a moment, the smell of burning flesh filled the Parisian air. Then, only smoke and the sound of prayers unanswered. The last stand of Jacques de Molay. 7 years passed. By 1314, the Order of the Temple was nothing more than a ghost. Its lands stolen, its members scattered, its name cursed. Only one remained, Jacques de Molay. Old, blind from torture, but unbroken. They led him to the scaffold on a cold March evening. The Seine glimmered with the light of torches, and across the river, the towers of Notre Dame stood silent, stone witnesses to a holy betrayal. A royal clerk read the sentence: Jacques de Molay, found guilty of heresy and idolatry, is condemned to eternal fire. The crowd murmured. De Molay raised his voice, a cracked whisper that cut through the wind. God knows who is wrong and who has sinned, he said. And soon a great calamity shall befall those who have condemned us unjustly. They lit the pyre. Flames climbed around him, twisting like serpents. His flesh burned, but his gaze never faltered. Witnesses swore that as the fire consumed him, he called out, "Pope Clement, King Philip, before God's throne, I summon you both within the year." And so it was written. Within months, both Pope Clement V and King Philip IV were dead, one of illness, the other of something darker, unnamed. Europe whispered that the curse of the Templars was real. Shadows of the cross. But curses fade, empires forget, and history buries its victims under the weight of its own lies. The ashes of the Templars were scattered, their temples razed, their seal broken. Yet beneath the ruins, the story refused to die. Some say the surviving knights fled across the seas, carrying relics too sacred or too dangerous to fall into royal hands. Others believe they merged with other orders, hiding in plain sight, their knowledge preserved through secret brotherhoods that still whisper in the dark corridors of Europe. And if you listen closely, in old churches, in the ruins of forgotten castles, you might still hear it, the echo of hooves, the rustle of white cloaks, and a voice that asks, "Who guards the guardians?" The story of the Templars was not just a tale of war and faith. It was a mirror showing how power corrupts, how holiness can be used as a weapon, and how truth burns brightest when surrounded by lies. But this was not the end, because in the heart of the Vatican, another drama was unfolding, one that would reveal just how far the Church itself had fallen. And that is where the next chapter begins. The flames that devoured Jacques de Molay did not stop at his flesh. They spread unseen, unheard through the corridors of Christendom. They burned not in the open air, but in the souls of men who watched and did nothing. When the Grand Master's final cry echoed over the Seine, it did not fade, it lingered. It clung to the minds of those who betrayed him, and among them, none bore its weight more heavily than the man who called himself the Vicar of Christ, Pope Clement V. At first, the Church celebrated its victory. The heretics had been silenced, the gold seized, the order dissolved. But victory is a thin mask for guilt, and guilt, once born, begins to speak. It began in whispers, the kind that stir at night when the torches die. The clergy murmured of strange happenings in Avignon, of the Pope falling ill without cause, of a presence in his chambers that no one dared to name. No one saw the curse, but all could feel it, as if the ashes of Jacques de Molay had drifted across France and settled in the lungs of the Holy See. Clement had dreamed of being a reformer, a shepherd who could guide a fractured church back to purity. But instead, he became the hand that signed its corruption. He had condemned men whose only crime was being too powerful to control, too faithful to break. Now he found that power had turned on him. The crown of St. Peter grown heavy, its gold pressed with invisible thorns. Each night his sleep was visited by the same voice, not shouting, not screaming, but calm, patient, unending. "You condemned us for silence," the voice would say. "But your silence was louder than our screams." He would wake trembling, cross himself, and call for prayer. But even his prayers felt empty, echoing back from a heaven gone cold. The cardinals began to whisper, too. Some said the Pope had grown paranoid, seeing the Templar cross in every shadow, hearing confessions from men long dead. Others insisted that divine justice was near, that the blood of the innocent had soaked too deeply into the soil of Christendom, to be ignored. But none dared confront him, because they feared the same thing he did, that the Church had not destroyed the Templars, it had destroyed itself. In the final months of his life, Clement withdrew into silence. Meetings were cancelled, letters unanswered. The bells of Avignon tolled for no one. When he did appear, his voice was thin, a ghost of the man who once held kings in his palm. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words chilled even the most hardened hearts. "There are sins," he said, "that do not die with the sinner. They pass on through walls, through crowns, through the robes of the innocent. They wait." And then he would fall silent again, staring at the crucifix before him, as if expecting it to speak back. By early 1314, Clement's health had begun to collapse. Physicians called it sickness of the lungs. The priests called it penance. He would not eat. He barely slept. And still, his attendants swore that in the small hours before dawn, they could hear him whispering confessions into the dark. "Forgive me, Lord, for I have betrayed my own knights. Forgive me, Lord, for I feared a king more than I feared you." But there was no absolution, only the same voice, quiet, relentless, asking, "Do you remember the fire?" When Clement finally died, it was not in peace. Witnesses claimed his body refused to burn clean during the funeral pyre, that strange winds tore through the courtyard, that the smoke twisted into shapes none dared describe. Within weeks, King Philip was dead as well, and across Europe, people whispered that Jacques de Molay's curse had come true. But was it really a curse? Or was it simply the weight of truth, returning to those who buried it? History would later call it coincidence. Historians would claim there was no curse, no divine punishment, only politics, disease, and the passage of time. But truth does not need proof. It needs memory. And memory is a crueler judge than any pope or king. The church survived, yes. It grew stronger, richer, more absolute. But something inside it died. Something that could never be rebuilt with gold or scripture. The Templars had been erased from its walls, but not from its conscience, because every altar built since their fall was laid on the same foundation of betrayal. Centuries would pass, empires would rise and fall, and still the Red Cross would return, not as an army, but as a question. Who decides what is holy? Who dares speak for God? And who, among men, can stand before the fire and claim to be pure? The Pope's betrayal was not the end of the Templars. It was their beginning, a transformation from flesh into myth, from soldiers into symbols, from history into prophecy, because faith cannot be burned, and guilt, once awakened, never sleeps. The echo of Jacques de Molay's curse still lingers not in stone, not in scripture, but in every hand that signs in the name of God, yet fears the truth that God remembers. And somewhere, beyond time and empire, the whisper returns once more. Who guards the guardians? They said the flames of Paris ended the story. But they were wrong. The fire did not die that night, it only changed form, from wood and ash to guilt and memory. And its next victim would not be a knight, but a pope. When Jacques de Molay burned, the smoke carried more than the smell of flesh. It carried a curse, a whisper that clung to the walls of Avignon, where Pope Clement V sat in his gilded cage of power. He had done what kings demanded. He had dissolved the order of the temple in the interest of the church's peace. But peace did not come, only silence. And in that silence, something began to rot. At night, the Pope could hear the echo of the pyres. They spoke not in words, but in presence, a suffocating weight that pressed against his chest as he tried to pray. The prayers no longer answered. The God he served no longer listened. And perhaps he wondered, was it truly God who had commanded the deaths of the Templars? Or was it something else entirely, a darker order, hidden beneath the robes of holiness? The sword of justice is heavy, he once said, and those who lift it in fear will always strike the innocent. Clement was not a cruel man, but he was a weak one. And weakness, when seated on a throne, becomes the deadliest sin of all. The trial of the Templars had been built on torture, on screams, on parchment stained with forced confessions. Yet he signed them all. Not because he believed, but because he was afraid to stand alone against the King of France. Fear has a sound. In Avignon, it was the whisper of quills scratching lies into law. It was the echo of footsteps in marble halls, as messengers brought reports of burned brothers and broken vows. It was the sound of a man trying to convince himself he had done the right thing. "God knows my heart," he told his confessor. "God knows I never meant harm." The confessor did not reply, because he too had heard the whispers in the chapel at night, voices of men who no longer had tongues to speak. Months passed, but the curse did not fade. The Pope's body began to fail, as though the same fire that devoured the Grand Master had found a home within his veins. His dreams turned to visions. Templar crosses bleeding light, faces half-burned but unbroken, and always that final moment. Molay's eyes meeting his across the centuries, through smoke and judgment. Clement would wake screaming, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in silence. And in those long hours before dawn, he would whisper to himself what no priest dared to hear. What if the Church betrayed its own soul that day? By 1314, the Pope's health was collapsing. He could not ride, he could barely write. And yet, he ordered one last Mass to be held not in the grand cathedral, but in his private chamber. Witnesses said the candles would not stay lit, that the air turned cold as the bread was broken, and when the Pope lifted the chalice, his hands trembled so violently the wine spilled onto the altar, a crimson trail like a wound that would never close. Within days, he was dead. Some said from fever, others said from the fire that never truly went out. And when they tried to move his body, the winds rose, a storm unlike any seen in Avignon. Lightning struck the church spire, and the papal coffin caught flame before it could be buried. It was as if the heavens themselves had come to finish what the earth had begun. They say the ashes of Pope Clement were never recovered. They scattered into the Rhône River, the same river that mirrored the sky as Jacques de Molay burned. And so, the curse of the Templars was complete. A king without heirs, a pope without a grave, a church without absolution. But history is a patient witness. It knows that curses do not end with the dead. They travel carried by crowns, by crosses, by the hands of those who think themselves clean. The order was gone, yet their secrets were not. In the ruins of the temple, hidden among charred stone and buried gold, something remained. A silence too deliberate, a disappearance too perfect, and in that silence, a new order began to whisper again. The fire of Paris had faded, the ashes of Molay scattered, and even the Pope himself had succumbed to the weight of his own conscience. Yet the story of the Templars did not end in smoke. It had only entered its most clandestine chapter. By the late 14th century, the order's public existence was extinguished. Its fortresses were taken, its banners torn, its names expunged from records. But true power, as history has always whispered, is rarely destroyed. It transforms. It hides. It waits. Survivors of the Purge scattered across Europe and beyond, to the rugged highlands of Scotland, the fortified ports of Portugal, the bustling trade cities of Italy, and even the remnants of the Levant. Each carried with them the memory of vows sworn in Jerusalem, the rituals of an order that had once commanded kings and feared popes. "We move like shadows," one anonymous Templar wrote in cipher, "but our hands still shape the world." Indeed, the hidden legacy of the Templars was not wealth alone, though that was considerable. It was knowledge, religious, scientific, and esoteric, treasures that could topple kingdoms if revealed too soon. Monastic libraries and abbeys became repositories for these secrets. Scrolls once forbidden, relics once sacred and dangerous, and documents detailing financial and political networks were carefully hidden from inquisitive eyes. Some manuscripts later appeared in the hands of scholars in Florence, Paris, and Venice. Their origins cloaked in mystery, their purpose intact, guiding the Renaissance in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. In Portugal, the surviving knights were quietly absorbed into the Order of Christ. Under the guise of missionary and military work, they preserved the knowledge, relics, and techniques of the Templars. They navigated the Atlantic, establishing footholds that centuries later would aid explorers of the New World. Meanwhile, in Italy, former Templars influenced banking and diplomacy. Families once indebted to the order became intertwined with them again. Their money, letters, and allegiances secretly managed by hands that remembered the crosses of Jerusalem. Through such means, the order's legacy became a hidden architecture beneath the surface of Europe, not a visible army, but a silent network shaping politics, commerce, and religion. "Our banners are gone," another survivor wrote, "but our influence is eternal." Even in France, where their destruction was most complete, whispers of secret societies endured. Legends of the Templar treasure circulated for generations. Hidden caches of gold, silver, and sacred relics that the church could not seize. Maps drawn in secrecy, passed from hand to hand, guided men who were sworn to secrecy through the forests and mountains, always careful to leave only shadows for those who followed. By the 15th century, rumors spread that Templar influence had penetrated the courts of kings and queens. Advisors, financiers, and military strategists were guided by principles and knowledge once held by the order. Even wars, sudden, decisive, and seemingly spontaneous, bore the mark of tactics perfected by knights who had survived centuries of erasure. The order's influence also seeped into intellectual and mystical circles. Esoteric knowledge, once kept strictly within Templar walls, found refuge among the scholars of the Renaissance. Alchemy, astronomy, mathematics, and religious philosophy were subtly shaped by the guardians of a secret heritage, a network invisible to those who saw only the public, church, the kings, and the empty castles. "We have no need to fight in the open," one scribe insisted. "The world is ours to guide if we remain unseen." Yet the order remained ever cautious. Public reemergence was forbidden. History had demonstrated the price of exposure. Kings would destroy, popes would condemn, armies would burn. So they worked quietly, influencing events from behind veils of secrecy, always remembering the flames that had taken Jacques de Molay and the silence that had followed. Over time, the Templars' hidden legacy became intertwined with the very fabric of Europe. Financial systems, clandestine diplomacy, the protection of relics, and the preservation of forbidden knowledge all bore traces of the order's invisible hand. Their survival was not measured in bodies or banners, but in the endurance of influence and secrets. By the 16th century, whispers began to reach legends. Stories of a hidden brotherhood, guardians of sacred knowledge, protectors of treasures thought lost, spread across courts and towns. Scholars and nobles alike speculated, was it the Templars themselves? Or the memory of an order too clever to die? Some even claimed that the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, and other artifacts had been spirited away by these invisible hands, to be preserved until the world was ready to see them again. And in every whisper, in every rumor, there was a subtle truth. The order's story had not ended. It had simply become invisible. "We are no longer knights," a late Templar scribe confided. "We are the keepers of what must not be lost." And so, the hidden legacy endured. Through wars, empires, revolutions, and plagues, The order persisted in silence, shaping events and protecting knowledge from sight. History remembers the visible, the crowns, the kings, the papal bulls. But the Templars remained in the invisible currents, in the letters never delivered, in the gold never counted, in the relics never seen. And somewhere, across Europe and the Mediterranean, their influence waits. Quiet, patient, eternal. Because the Order of the Temple was never just an army of men. It was an idea, a discipline, a network, a principle that could survive fire, betrayal, and death. And ideas, once born, never die. The flames of Paris, the ashes of Molay, the silent halls of Avignon, these were only the beginning. The Order of the Temple had been erased from maps and charters, but not from influence. Centuries passed, kingdoms rose and fell, empires expanded and crumbled, yet the hidden hand of the Templars remained. By the 17th century, whispers of their legacy had transformed into networks. Webs of influence connecting financiers, scholars, and rulers across Europe. Their old expertise in banking, logistics, and diplomacy became invisible channels, guiding wealth, decisions, and policy. Every gold coin that moved between cities, every treaty signed under secrecy, every relic protected in obscurity, all bore traces of the Order's silent intervention. "We do not seek glory," a ciphered note read. "For those who are watched are never free." In France, secret societies emerged, some openly claiming inspiration from the Templars, others maintaining strict anonymity. They preserved rituals, codes, and the memory of an order that could not exist openly. Even the rise of the Freemasons carried echoes of the Templar discipline, a devotion to secrecy, brotherhood, and the protection of knowledge. Across the Atlantic, the Age of Exploration offered new opportunities. Portugal and Spain, still influenced by surviving Templar networks, funded voyages with careful precision, sending navigators to chart lands unknown, while secretly safeguarding ancient knowledge and relics. The Order's expertise in navigation, finance, and strategy ensured their influence persisted far beyond European borders. "The world watches without seeing," another scribe noted. "And we move as the currents of the sea, invisible, inexorable." Even in the halls of kings and popes, the Templars' legacy was present. Advisors, once trained in their methods, whispered guidance. Church officials, their loyalties subtly redirected. Financiers, their strategies informed by centuries of the Order's unseen networks. Wars and alliances seemed spontaneous, yet they often followed patterns the Templars had once perfected. Relics and manuscripts continued to vanish from view, carefully relocated to safe havens across Europe and the Mediterranean. Some texts appeared in universities centuries later, influencing science, philosophy, and religion. Some treasures re-emerged in royal collections, yet their provenance remained mysterious, as if protected by a hand that time itself could not touch. By the 19th century, rumors of secret Templar cells persisted in France, Italy, and England. Some claimed the order was extinct. Others said it had simply transformed. Its knights no longer in white mantles, but in suits, robes, and offices of power. The principle remained: secrecy was survival. Patience was weapon. Influence was eternity. "We are eternal watchers," a hidden memorandum once stated. Guardians of that which the world cannot yet bear to know. Even as Europe industrialized, the Templars' networks adapted. Banks, governments, and religious institutions were subtly guided by those who understood the lessons of betrayal and survival. No longer warriors with swords, but guardians with knowledge. Their influence invisible yet pervasive. Wars in the 20th century, sudden, catastrophic, and global, sometimes seemed inexplicable in their origins. their outcomes guided by strategic planning reminiscent of Templar foresight. Coincidence, some historians said. But those who studied the patterns recognized an underlying architecture, a legacy of hidden intelligence, patience, and foresight perfected over centuries. Even today, whispers suggest that descendants of the order, not necessarily by blood, but by oath, knowledge, and secrecy, still watch. Through think tanks, banks, religious councils, and academic institutions, the principles of the Templars endure: discipline, secrecy, influence, and protection of knowledge. "We are not extinct," one coded message claimed. "We are eternal. The flame endures where the world cannot see." And so, the Templar story, though invisible, continues. The castles may lie in ruin, the banners may be gone, but the legacy persists in the currents of history. Every alliance formed, every secret guarded, every relic preserved, echoes the vigilance of those who once wore white mantles with red crosses. History remembers the visible, but the eternal watchers remember differently. They understand that true survival is not in stone, not in titles, not in swords, but in patience, knowledge, and influence. Across continents, through centuries, they endure. Invisible, silent, watching. The order of the temple was never truly gone, because the ideas of power, secrecy, and sacred duty, cannot be burned. And the flame, once lit, never dies. They survived fire. They survived exile. They survived centuries of silence. But the greatest secret of the Knights Templar was not their fall. It was their persistence. By the dawn of the modern age, the world had changed beyond recognition. Empires collapsed, kingdoms fractured, science challenged scripture, and yet the invisible fingerprints of the Templars could still be traced. In the very foundations of the systems that shaped Europe, their influence no longer rode on horseback. It operated through ideas, institutions, and networks built with patience. The kind of patience only an order forged in fire could possess. Across the banking world, financial models created by medieval Templar treasurers evolved into modern institutions. In diplomacy, their methods of encrypted letters and coded negotiations became the backbone of intelligence agencies. Even the concept of international credit, a Templar invention, became a pillar of global economics. But it wasn't wealth or power that defined their final legacy. It was guardianship. The relics they once protected, scrolls, maps, texts, and objects considered too dangerous or too transformative, were believed to be hidden within a chain of private archives, monasteries, and discreet families across Europe. No vault, no temple, just a network designed to outlive kingdoms. Knowledge is the only kingdom that cannot be conquered. One late Templar scribe wrote, "Through the Enlightenment, revolutions, and world wars, whispers persisted of a quiet brotherhood guiding decisions from behind the curtain. Not ruling, not controlling, but preserving. Preserving history, preserving truth, preserving whatever the world was not yet ready to see." By the 20th century, countless groups claimed descent from the order, some truthful, many fraudulent. But the real heirs, if they existed, never spoke. That was the rule. Silence was survival. Today, some believe the Templar lineage remains hidden within think tanks, philanthropic networks, academic institutions, or discreet religious circles. Others insist the order ended long ago. But history teaches us a simple truth. If an idea is powerful enough to threaten kings and popes, then it is powerful enough to endure forever. The Knights Templar began as guardians of pilgrims. They became guardians of secrets. And in the end, they became guardians of time itself. Their story closes here, not with certainty, but with possibility. Because some legacies do not end. They simply step deeper into the shadows. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden world of the Knights Templar, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten chapters of history. And tell us in the comments, which mystery should we explore next? The Lost Library of Alexandria? The secret archives of the Vatican? Or perhaps the real story behind the Holy Grail? Your suggestion might become our next episode.